Hello, everyone, and welcome to BibleQuest.tv, the Tuesday edition. We're glad you're able to join us today as we have a live discussion on Bible topics and answering questions from the audience. We want to hear from you. Those of you who are watching it on a YouTube channel, go ahead and put in your comments there in the chat box area. If you're coming in through the Zoom app, we invite you to open up the Q&A window, where you can type in your questions right there and we'll address them. Or if you're in the Zoom app, you can also come in via audio. You can use your computer audio if you want to ask us or talk with us live on the air. And we're happy you're able to join us. I want to welcome Scott with us. Scott is our program director. Scott, how you doing?
Drew, I'm doing fine. How are you today?
Doing very good, thank you. And Jonathan is joining us today as a panelist. Jonathan is also our webcast engineer who helps us with the monitoring, but today he's also acting as panelist today, officially. Glad to have you here, Jonathan. Thank you.
Yeah, it's good to be with you guys.
And before we get into the topic and questions that we're going to be talking about, I do want to do a little housekeeping, if you will. Got an email from someone talking about the website, how they're enjoying the recordings. I just want to tell everybody we are recording all of our sessions. They get posted on BibleQuest.tv, usually within 24 to 48 hours, most of the time 24 hours. Also, a lot of people are downloading the podcast so that if you don't have time to watch it live in the afternoon, but you want to hear us, and if you're hearing us now on the podcast, you already know how to do that. But share it with other people that we also have podcast capabilities. Again, download the podcast or click on the podcast link on the website, BibleQuest.tv. And one last thing is the videos were not playing or showing the control panel to pause and rewind the videos. And someone had emailed us and said, could we have that feature? Because I wanted to back up and hear what you just said. And yeah, that was taken off, but I don't know why that was taken off. So today, by the end of the day today, that feature will be up. So if you're watching the videos rather, you can just pause and go back and forth as you want. And I appreciate that. That tells me that people are really paying attention and actually interested in watching the recordings and listening to what we're talking about. And we invite you to comment, send us your questions, and let us talk some more about the things you want to hear from the Bible. So before we get any further, and I bring in the question, did you want to make any other comments or observations before I read the statement today or the topic? We're all ready to go?
Go right ahead.
Okay, so we're talking about cultural seepage. In other words, does the American culture affect how we behave as Christians? In other words, in what ways does American culture infiltrate churches? I mean, since it wasn't as Christians that they were behaving, but as Corinthians, these were the people in Corinth, the first century that Paul was writing to, they were affected by their culture. And is there a relationship between our culture and our behavior as Christians? So, Scott, you want to take that away?
Yeah, and what I'd like everybody to think about, and in a few minutes, we're going to ask you to start submitting your thoughts on this. So instead of you asking questions today, we're asking a question. And the question is basically this, and I hope it'll be more vivid in a moment. But the question is, if the Lord came and visited us, as a typical Christian family, church or something in the United States in the 21st century, or if the Apostle Paul came through, what would stand out to them as out of line or out of order that we just take for granted because, well, that's what everybody does? And I want us to illustrate it with the city of Corinth. So have you ever read the book of 1 Corinthians and just kind of been shocked that these things were going on in a church? Because, I mean, it's just a mess. Very quickly here, just point by point, start naming off, guys, some of the problems that were going on inside that church.
Sexual immorality right off in the beginning, right?
Yeah. Sexual immorality. What else?
They were kind of their culture was taken with philosophy, and so there were factions, divisions in the church trying to establish one person higher than another.
Yeah, a lot of factions, a lot of love of philosophy. In chapters 1 through 4, it's kind of lasagna back and forth with things about not lining up after certain teachers and then warnings against the love of philosophy. What else?
Well, they were not hesitant to take each other to court, suing each other.
Brethren are suing each other. Chapter 6. One believer taking another believer before unbelievers in court. What else?
There was just a general lack of concern for each other, and how Paul states a lack of love, especially when he gets to kind of the pinnacle of that discussion. It's really all throughout the whole book, but in chapter 13, he identifies their real problem. So they were, one way they were doing that, in chapters 12 through 14, they were saying that they wanted more spiritual gifts, and they were placing a higher priority on, well, if you can speak in tongues, then you're more important than someone who can interpret tongues, and you're more important than someone who can prophesy, and so forth. So
a lot of jealousy. How are they treating the Lord's Supper? They're neglecting the poor. Somebody's getting drunken. It's just like, how on earth could this stuff be going on in a church? And I think the answer we're going to see is because some of these things didn't seem, with one exception, particularly shocking to them, because they were Corinthians and this stuff was kind of par for the course. And so what felt like to them as normal is appalling in our eyes, and of course in the eyes of Paul, who writes to them. And so in a minute, we're going to look at a few quotes to illustrate this, but then in a minute, we're going to ask, what about our culture? So for audience, we want you to be thinking about what things might be going on in our culture that are seeping into churches that we might not be as aware, as ashamed as we should be of. Anything further before we start looking at a few quotes?
When you're saying culture, you're referring to our American culture.
Yes. So different people are not monolithic. Not everybody in the church at Corinth was the same. Some needed to be warned against prostitutes. Others needed to be told, no, it's okay to touch your wife and be with your wife. So not everybody's the same. But stereotypically, Corinth was a really wicked place, just like Crete. Paul quotes a Cretan as describing what were the people of Crete like.
they were gluttons.
Yeah, idle gluttons and liars. So if you have a bunch of people in Crete that have been baptized into Christ, but they haven't put away the old man, what are they still like going to be?
Cretans.
Yeah. And so we want to, it's sometimes easier to see the fault somewhere else than in the mirror, which is why Nathan with David puts the problem over there on the two guys with the sheep, so that he can see it vividly. So let's go ahead now and get into, go ahead, Drew.
Well, that's a bold statement that Paul made, calling them liars and gluttons?
Yeah.
But wasn't it he quoting one of their own poets that were admitting that was their culture?
Yes, exactly. He was quoting one of their own poets to that effect. And I am trying to figure out how to I've got my share screen on, but all of us are right in the middle. There we go. I think I got it moved. All right. So Corinth was right here at an isthmus. And so ships would come along, and they would come from the east going west, and whatever they're carrying would go overland, either in a small ship over the land or ship to a bigger ship. A lot of money coming through, and that means a lot of sailors coming through. It would also go from west to east as well as east to west. Now, anytime you have a port city with a whole lot of sailors coming through who have been, weeks at sea, what likely are they going to be looking for when they get to town?
Having a good time.
Yeah. And so that's what Corinth was. It was a good time town for the sailors. And so it's full of money. It's got a lot of visitors coming through, a lot of sailors. And so there's a lot of prostitution. There's a love of philosophy because they're near Athens, and there's a lot of paganism. So I'm going to read some quotes now. And some of these are from a book called St. Paul's Corinth by Jerome Murphy O'Connor. It's a good little book I recommend. What the author did, he went through and he selected statements from pagan writers, Greek and Latin, who visited the city of Corinth and described what it was like in other historical references. So just let's take a look historically at what things were like sexually there. From ancient times, the term, back this is hundreds of years before Christ, but the term Corinthia zestai, that meant to act like a Corinthian, in other words, to practice fornication. There was a play, which in English is The Whoremonger, but in Greek, it has the word Corinth in it. And Plato used the phrase Corinthia chora to refer to a prostitute. So imagine if you lived in a town and that town had such a vile reputation, like Honesdale is where you live, right, Drew?
Yep.
What the word Honesdale girl meant prostitute. That would tell you a lot about what that place was like, right?
Yeah.
All right, let's continue on. Strabo on Old Corinth. There was Old Corinth. It was destroyed and rebuilt. There was New Corinth. But because of its position with all the sailors coming through, a lot of things stayed the same as far as that goes. The Temple of Aphrodite in Old Corinth owned more than 1,000 temple slaves, prostitutes. On account of these women, the city was crowded with people and grew rich. Plutarch referred to the great army of harlots, and he was born just before Paul came to Corinth. So we see it was a problem before and later. Dio Chrysostom talks about the large numbers gathered at Corinth on account of the harbors and the heterae. Those are the high dollar prostitutes. Philosophy is close to Athens, and of course, Athens is famous for what? Philosophers. They loved oratory, rhetoric, impressive speech. Notice, what letters is it where Paul refers to the fact that he didn't come in persuasive words of wisdom, philosophy, and great oratory skills? Who is he writing to when he says, I know how you talk about me, that you say my speech isn't good? He's writing to the Corinthians. Yeah, they like things that sounded really good. There's reference throughout chapter 1 through 4 and later to this love of philosophy. You had different schools of philosophy. The Epicureans, their motto was eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. That's the motto Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians 15, saying if there's not a resurrection, why not? Think like the Epicureans. And this one's really interesting to me. This is Dio Chrysostom. He's born around 40 AD. Now, this is supposed to be a portrayal of another guy in history at Corinth many years before. But because he lives in 40 AD, it's probably an accurate picture of what Corinth was like then, and maybe the other time as well. He's talking about when they would gather for the Isthmian Games, which were just north Corinth. One could hear the crowds of the wretched sophists, philosophers, around Poseidon's temples shouting and reviling one another, and their disciples, as they were called, fighting with one another. So see these people enamored with philosophy, and you have, here's a teacher, and he's got his what?
Disciples, his followers.
And here's another one, and he's got his disciples, and here's another one. And then those disciples are fighting with each other. Well, in 1 Corinthians 1, have the Corinthians line themselves after different teachers.
Yeah.
Some saying of Paul, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos. And in chapter 4, he says, I'm applying these things to myself and Apollos for your sake, so that you might learn in us not to go beyond the things that are written. So I believe there are also people there at Corinth, there right now, who are trying to get people to follow them, and hence all those references to philosophy. And they're full of envy and strife. They're fighting with each other. Lawsuits. Dio Chrysostom refers to lawyers innumerable perverting justice. William Barclay says the law courts were in fact one of their chief amusements and entertainments. Going to law was integrally bound up with Greek life. They were in fact famous or notorious for their love of going to law. And then of course idolatry. You've got idols all over the place. And the next two quotes, one of them is not actually about Corinth, but somewhere in the Greco-Roman world in general, and the other maybe, but you can see, like, here's an invitation to dinner. Harius asks you to dine in the room of a Schlepion at a banquet of the Lord, so an idol temple banquet. And then here's an invitation for a dinner to come to, and it's already been sacrificed, etc. So summing this up, Corinthian culture included immorality, prostitution, fornication, homosexuality, love of philosophy, lawsuits, and idolatry. Now, those things were part of the Corinthian world. What about the Corinthian church? In the world, you had these things, and what did you have in the church?
Same thing.
All those things. And it's interesting with the exception of maybe the idolatry with the food offered to idols. The Corinthians asked about those things whenever Paul was writing back to them, and in the letter you see that starting in chapter 7. He says, now concerning what you wrote about this or what about this, but they didn't ask anything concerning the sexual immorality happening in the church or the lawsuits happening in the church or the factions that were happening in the church. That was brought up to Paul by other people. And we read that and we think, how would that just be okay? That there's a man who's sleeping with his father's wife in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Well, part of the culture. It just kind of, as we've kind of titled our broadcast, it seeped in, and that's just normal life.
And in that case, they'd even exceeded what was normal for Corinth, because Paul will say in 5:1, and you're committing adult fornication that is not even practiced among the Gentiles. So in that one particular case, they've even gone beyond. But what Jonathan just mentioned about the letter and the report. So I want to touch on that for a minute. But first, I want to get this out there so our audience can be thinking about this and start submitting some answers. And then, Jonathan, don't let me forget to come back to that. If that's what happened then, and if we read 1 Corinthians and think, how on earth could they be operating like this or thinking this is in any way acceptable? It's because some of them have not put off the old man. They're still thinking like Corinthians. The seepage of Corinth has seeped into that church. So here's our question for today. What about our culture? And what about us? What things pervade our culture that, if we looked at it, we might not, but it just seems normal to us because it's part of the culture. And it seeps in and corrupts. That's what I want to ask our audience to start submitting some responses to. But now, while we're waiting on that, I want to come back to what you said, Jonathan. So, 1 Corinthians is written in response to two sources of information that have come to Paul. The one is the letter that they wrote. How do we know that they wrote a letter to Paul?
He refers to that.
Yeah, starting in chapter 7 is the first reference that I'm aware of. In chapter 7, verse 1, he says, now concerning the matters about which you wrote. And he says that again or later in the chapter in verse 25, and then in chapter 8. So really kind of through the rest of the book, starting in chapter 7, he refers to what you wrote to me. Here's the answer.
Yeah. And so we know they wrote a letter. And then after there, you have the other now concerning. But then there's other things that didn't come in the letter. It came through reports. Like it has been reported by the household of Chloe, chapter 1, that what?
That this sexual morality exists among you.
Yeah.
Divisions, right? Does she also mention the divisions?
Yeah, that's chapter 1, the divisions. Chapter 5 it's been reported sexual immorality. Chapter 1 was the divisions. Chapter 11, the abuse of the Lord's Supper. And I've compared it to if parents are out of town and teenagers send an email and they want to know, hey, where do you keep the grill tools? Where do you keep the propane? Hey, where's this? Where's that? And the neighbors call and say, did you know the police were at your house last night? And there's, they don't say everything in the email that might be going on. Drew, I'm having trouble stopping share here. And as you know, you're a Mac guy and I am new to Mac and I can't find how to stop the share.
Jonathan, you can stop the share from your end, right?
Yeah, it's good now.
I saw stop share, but I can't find my cursor. All right. So, are we back to our regular screen?
Yeah, look for the Zoom app icon at the bottom. Click on that, and it'll focus your Zoom.
Yeah, very good. Okay, so we've seen what happened to the church at Corinth. They were not acting like disciples of Christ, many of them, too many of them. They were acting like Corinthians. What are some things in our culture that can slip in without us even noticing it? And maybe a good way to think about it would be this. Let's just think not just about Jesus coming or Paul coming. How about when Americans go overseas? What kind of reputation do Americans have when we go overseas?
Well, it used to be there was a term called the ugly American.
Yeah. The ugly American. And was it about our physical appearance? It was about
the way we behaved.
Yeah, and what were some of those ways?
And arrogance.
Yeah, and suppose the three of us go overseas to plant a church. Somebody just pick some kind of remote country.
Sierra Leone.
All right. So we go there and we get there and immediately we start complaining because things aren't like what?
Like the way it is at home.
Yeah. Now, Sierra Leone, they speak English. So let's pick a place that doesn't speak English. Let's say we go to Madagascar, okay? And I don't know what they speak there. Suppose we go to Hungary. And if we're complaining, why doesn't anybody speak English? What would we think of a Bulgarian that came into our country and started fussing because we don't speak Bulgarian?
Who do you think he is?
You're in our country.
we Americans tend to be, unfortunately, too often arrogant people. Do you suppose any brethren have let that culture slide into our lives and into churches?
Sadly.
Yeah. And one of the comments while the other viewers, like we said before, the other viewers, what we're looking for is for your all's ideas, things that our culture is kind of known for that seems to have maybe seeped into the church. And we have one comment that came in from Karen, which is an interesting idea. How she worded it is Facebook-like bashing of political figures is infiltrating the church. So just a general kind of disrespect for government officials. And you see that all throughout American culture, and just a general disrespectful nature towards not only other countries, but other people in general. It's kind of a my way or the highway type of mentality, and specifically relating to the government. It's not an acceptable way for the church to act. And so one passage that comes to my mind just to bring up on the subject is Romans chapter 13.
Right.
What should our attitude be towards the government, especially as children of God? Well, in Romans chapter 13, in verse 1, he says, let every person, Paul writing to the Romans says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resist what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is an authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. And so the picture that Paul paints is fascinating when you consider what government he's talking about. He's talking about the Roman government, which in a lot of ways was contrary to the Christian ideas. And Paul says, look, I know what the government is. That was instituted by God, and you need to respect that, and you need to follow that.
Wait a minute, guys, wait a minute, guys. So you're saying that I'm not to bash the president or Congress for the immoral things they're doing, or pick on them because I don't like the way they're doing things? Is that what you're saying, guys? Because this is a natural thing in America to do these things.
Yeah. We live in a democratic republic, which means that we get to vote, which means we've got an advantage most people have never had If we don't think a ruler is a good ruler, we can vote him out and vote somebody else in.
But wait a minute, Scott, I've got freedom of speech too, so I can say anything I want about him.
And freedom of speech doesn't mean that all speech is good. So 1 Peter 2:17, honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. There's a certain amount of honor and respect that needs to be shown for the person in office, whether they are an honorable person or not. The office is to be respected. So when Donald Trump is the president of the United States, Donald Trump is the president of the United States. When Barack Obama was the president of the United States, Barack Obama was the president of the United States, and so on and so on. Now, you and I may look back at different presidents and feel this was a great president, this one wasn't, this one did things that hurt the country, did things that were better, et cetera, and most of them are going to be a mixed bag. But the degree to which the disrespect and just, I'll tell you this. When I was 15, I was planning to be a cartoonist. Local newspaper put one of my little editorial cartoons, did a little article about me, and I was thinking, I would like to do that. But then I got to thinking about it. I'm politically minded. I do care about politics, and I think policies are important in a country. But to be an effective political cartoonist, how do you have to portray the person that you're contrasting their ideas with?
Maybe in a foolish light, definitely not a complimentary light.
Yeah. There's not a lot of nuance there. You don't draw whoever's president or whoever's Speaker of the House in a flattering way and just put a comment in there. It might be helpful if they would remember this principle. No, you try to make them look ridiculous. And I realized I can't do that. As a Christian, I can't sit there and just be insulting and just attacking like that. It wouldn't be in keeping with these principles.
But wait a minute. I don't know if Karen realizes she brought up a very, I was going to say subtle point. It's not subtle. It's actually an amazing point, because it's easy for me as an American growing up in this free society to have that cultural influence on me. And then when I compare, you're trying to compare this to the things that Corinth were doing. Come on, Scott, immorality at that level, that's not even close. I mean, what I'm doing and bashing the president is not even close to what they were doing back there. So I think the point I'm trying to make is it's easy for me to point at them and their errors, but something as simple as bashing political
being dishonorable,
that's not a big deal. Come on, guys.
And let's notice the difference between valid criticism and just hateful disrespect.
Yeah.
Did Peter agree with the Sanhedrin when they said and that was a political body. When the Jewish Senate told Peter, stop talking about Jesus Christ, did Peter agree with them?
No, not at all.
He said, but judge within yourselves. Should we obey you or should we obey God? Mm-hmm. So because they didn't just do a policy he didn't like, but were telling him to disobey the Lord, he refused to do that. And he told them so. But there's a difference between, and Stephen will strongly rebuke them when he's before them. So there's a place for criticism, there's a place for rebuke, but I think we all know the maliciousness and just the slander that goes on against political figures. But it's part of our culture. Mm-hmm. It's normal. All of our friends make fun of them all of our friends, use foul language about them. Our newspapers are full of pictures of them, making them look grotesque and ridiculous. So we just pile in and join on. And I think Jonathan mentioned before, when Peter wrote this, honor the king, who's Caesar?
Yeah.
Nero.
Wasn't he Nero?
Have we ever had a president near as bad as Nero?
No.
Not even close.
Not even close. So if Christians at that time were to honor Nero, not for Nero's character, they're not honoring Nero because he killed his mother, but if he's Caesar, he's Caesar. And Jesus himself said what? Render unto
Caesar what is Caesar's.
Yeah.
And so going on with that idea, if you're not supposed to be disrespectful, but you don't agree with a government official or criticizing, how do you do that? How do you do that as a Christian? What are some helpful tips to be able to do that in the correct way?
Well, first of all, let me interrupt you there, Scott, but you had used the word slander in some of your discussion on what people are doing.
Yeah.
And that is key, because what we'll do is we'll hear lies, or they may be lies we don't know, but we don't even check them out. And then we perpetuate them on Facebook or other channels and just spread that out. So I guess the first thing we need to do is find out what is being said, is it true or not, and then stand for truth. Forget what side, what is the truth of that?
Let's take this for example. Say Hillary murdered Vince Foster. Well, I don't know for sure how Vince Foster died, and there's been a lot of corruption in a lot of individuals, but who, without knowing more about the crime scene evidence and with no prosecution being brought to bear and a jury being able to determine, why should anybody have the right to make an accusation like that against a public figure? But things like that just get said.
Mm-hmm.
Well, especially if you don't like the public figure, it's easy for you to fall into it.
Then we're happy to believe the worst. And occasionally, the worst may be true. Occasionally, it may not be true. And occasionally, the person we're fighting for is actually as guilty or guiltier than somebody else.
Yeah. So one thing I think would be helpful to bring up, and the reason why I asked that question, and then I'll give an answer if you guys have anything else. Also, the whole thought process here is our culture thinks that things are normal and a good way to act, and when we compare them with God's will for Christians, it just falls so short of God's plans for us and how we're supposed to act. And that idea is brought up by Paul in his letter to the Ephesians. And his antidote, so to speak, for that is what he says in Ephesians chapter 4, starting in verse 17. He says, "Now this I say and testify to the Lord, that you no longer walk as the Gentiles do in the futility of their minds. They are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to their hardness of heart. They've become callous and have given themselves up to sensuality, greedy to practice every kind of impurity." Sounds a lot like what we're talking about now. There's a lot of evil, a lot of darkened understanding that is alienating people from God in American culture. And Paul says in the next verse, "But that's not the way that you learned Christ," assuming that you have heard about him and were taught about him as the truth in Jesus, to put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life, and to the corrupt and is corrupt through deceitful desires, and to be renewed in your spirit of your minds, and put on the new self, created in the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. So the way that Christians are supposed to respond to becoming a Christian is, regardless of what culture you're from, regardless of where in the world that you live, anything that was evil in that old culture, put it away, get done with it, and bring something new in. And so Paul goes through the rest of that chapter and into chapter 5 saying, quit stealing, start working with your hands. Quit lying, start speaking good things. And so as it relates to being disrespectful to government officials, which is a huge cultural thing that happens in America, the thing that you can do as a Christian when you disagree with somebody and respectfully are trying to critique them is what Paul tells Timothy to do in 1 Timothy chapter 2. 1 Timothy 2 verse 1. "First of all, then I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and for all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way." If you don't agree with what's happening in the government, that's fine. You don't have to go on Facebook and post it to everybody and complain and bash people. You don't have to draw a cartoon that makes somebody look ridiculous. You don't have to badmouth an official. What you can do is pray for them.
Yeah, you can
pray that God, understand that God is in control of that government, like we read in Romans chapter 13, and understand that your responsibility is not to enact vengeance on them. Your responsibility is to pray for them.
Right. And because we're in a country where we are given the right to vote, nothing wrong with a Christian voting and voting, for those that will uphold the better principles between two. And sometimes, the choices aren't great. But you can vote, and I think in a respectful way, in a fair way, you can discuss politics with other people. Mm-hmm. But you should sound like a disciple of Christ when you're doing it, not a vindictive partisan.
All right, so
and our country is all of vindictive partisans.
So this is the American culture, and what you're discussing is sort of like a blood sport. And that influences us in our behavior, and we don't think of it as being something wrong. But what about something else? Is there other cultural things that you can think of?
Related to that, just the idea of liberty. Now, that's a great thing, liberty. But we've gotten so accustomed to it that I think we as a nation too much have forgotten the importance of responsibility in our quest for liberty. Now, at some earlier points in our government, I think there were people that understood along with liberty went a lot of responsibility. Mm-hmm. But as generations come and go, and as we've prospered off the progress made in the past and building on the capital built up in the past, I think the moral character of our nation has gone downhill, and we talk too much about I have the right and not enough about what is right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're still looking for from the audience your thoughts, and you can comment those here on the Zoom app or on our YouTube. Live, just different things in the culture and American culture that seemingly are part of the culture have seeped into the church. And so we're looking at that. So that first one we talked about was with the government officials, and the general disrespect, especially on social media, for government officials. Another one that comes to mind while we're thinking about some things is just a general lack of discipline in what type of entertainment we use in American culture. And that's the entertainment industry is a huge industry in America, from sporting events to music to movies, all kinds of different things. And frankly, a lot of the entertainment in America is just garbage. It's just trash, particularly in movies. And because it's normal when a new movie comes out, people want to go see that movie. And the general question is, hey, have you seen this movie? Have you been to see this? Without thinking, what is that movie conveying? What is in that movie? Foul language, sexual immorality. A common theme in a lot of sitcoms is a disrespect of the father figure in the family.
Yes.
Father figures in sitcoms are displayed as ignorant, idiotic. They're not respected. They can't do anything right. And that's not the biblical picture. The biblical picture of a father in the family is they're the head of the house, and they need to be honored as that. And so as it relates to how we need to filter the entertainment that we choose as Christians, as opposed to the entertainment that's chosen by our culture, I think the attitude that David has in Psalm 101 is really helpful to consider. In Psalm 101, when David's writing this psalm, starting in verse 2, he says, I will ponder the way that is blameless. Oh, when will you come to me? I will walk with integrity of heart within my house. I will not set before my eyes anything that is worthless. I hate the work of those who fall away. It shall not cling to me. A perverse heart shall be far from me. I will know nothing of evil. Whoever slanders his neighbor secretly, I will destroy. Whoever has a haughty look or an arrogant heart, I will not endure. I will look with favor on the faithful in the land, that they may dwell with me. He who walks in this way is blameless, shall minister to me. No one who practices deceit shall dwell in my house. No one who utters lies shall continue before my eyes. And so that the attitude that he has there is, I'm putting my foot down. I'm not going to give in to any of this stuff. And when you go through that list, the things that he says, I'm not going to endure, I'm not going to have before my eyes, that's not going to be in my house. No one who practices deceit will be in my house. No one who hates another person will be in my house. No perverse heart shall be before my eyes. How many of those things fall into things that we entertain ourselves with on a daily basis? How much music has that type of sinful nature that we listen to, or the different movies or things like that? It's just something to consider as Christians. The way that Americans in general entertain themselves, a lot of the time is not okay for a Christian to entertain themselves in that way.
What you're talking about there, Jonathan, is what Scott was leading to with liberty. Because we have such freedom and liberty, we can do what we want in this country, and we've got that attitude. And what you're talking about, Jonathan, is controlling self, disciplining self,
Right.
against our natural instincts, if that's even a true way to put it. We want to not have any control of ourselves. And so you're looking at, well, what's the priority here? Well, if the priority is not to seek God and serve God, then what does Paul say in Romans? We seek the creature. We want to serve the creature. And there, I think, is really where the crutch is. We can look at our culture and how it's influencing us, but it really comes down to what it is we want, what I want to do.
And, we can say, oh, this movie won't affect me. This won't bother me. This won't affect me. This won't bother me. Evil companions corrupt good morals. And if your chief companionship is immorality on a screen, that's not going to affect you.
Well, the advertising industry knows how they can affect people, so there's something going on there. So there was a comment that came in from Joshua, and he's talking about referring to people if they would read 1st and 2nd Corinthians. What is going on? I didn't put these things on hold here. Sorry about that. You like that little ring there, Scott?
Yeah.
Sorry, I got distracted. But anyway, he's talking about people putting in more time in reading 1st and 2nd Corinthians and reading the Bible rather than other things. And it'll be amazing once you do that, what you're finding out, what you're knowing, what you're learning from God. And again, that comes back to what's my priority? What's motivating me? What do I want to do? If I want to serve God, then I will read his book.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Any other cultural things coming in? We got a few minutes left there. Any other cultural things that affect us as in our behaviors as Christians?
How about just materialism? We are an extremely wealthy country. Now, not everybody might think, oh, I'm not wealthy. Well, compared to most people of most history, you're wealthy.
Yeah.
Even if you live in the smallest apartment in town, you know what? The rich people, 200 years ago didn't have indoor plumbing and electricity and, air conditioning. In the summer, it was hot. And if you're headed out to an outhouse and, that we would consider insufferable, what most people have lived through. But most of us have more than just indoor plumbing and these other things. And we become materialistic. And I'll just put it this way. Americans are better at getting better houses, but not better homes.
Yeah.
And Americans tend to be better at planning weddings than they do planning marriage. Mm-hmm. So the wedding may be very impressive, thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars, and the bride is satisfied that it's such a better wedding than her cousin had last year. And Drew, you used to be involved somewhat in the wedding industry. You probably saw a lot of that kind of bridezilla type thing occasionally.
Oh, absolutely. I used to do that when I was a photographer way back when. I photographed weddings. Yeah, I see a lot of that.
Yeah, and everything has to be just right for the wedding, and then 6 years later they're divorced. Mm-hmm. There should have been more planning for that. And you think of all these homes, these big, huge McMansions that people live in the suburbs out of the big cities, and all the money that goes into these huge houses with rooms that are even seldom used, and their kids have all of these gadgets and new cars and stuff. But one thing is not happening, and that's the fathers and the mothers are not spending time with their children, and the children are not being raised. So they've got the magnificent house and a dysfunctional family.
It's funny you mentioned about the divorces. I recall at least one time when I photographed the wedding, they went the proofs, and it took like 6-7 months before the book was actually going to be finished in printing. Before we got it done, they were going through divorce procedures.
Wow. Jonathan.
And going back to something as we're kind of wrapping up, something that Drew brought up. Well, so what's the big deal when we compare America to the Corinthians? Corinthians were pretty bad when we look at that, but we're just talking bad about government officials. We're just watching movies that maybe might not be the best. It doesn't seem like it's up to par.
Well, just ignoring our kids and being covetous, more and more stuff.
Yeah, and one last thing that I want to bring up, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, but I think is a huge issue in America, is this idea of kind of what Jesus talks about in Matthew chapter 5. What he says to the people in Matthew 5 can be perfectly applied to Americans today. In Matthew 5:27, you've heard it was said, "You shall not commit adultery," but I say to you, everyone who looks on a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Americans generally understand that you don't cheat on your spouse. They get that adultery is wrong. Generally, there are some that maybe not, but mostly our culture identifies that. But when it's bad to cheat on your spouse, it's okay to go and watch pornography. What's the big deal with that in our culture? And that's a huge epidemic, which we talked about before. But there are a lot of things in our culture that are still addressed in the Bible. That it doesn't seem like a big deal to Americans, and it's a big deal to Jesus. It's a big deal to God, and he brings them up.
And a lot of this has to do with the attitude that a lot of teenagers will tell their parents, "Oh, what's the big deal?" And then they say something that begins with the word everybody.
Yeah, everybody does it.
Yeah, everybody does it. And it's not everybody, but if most people are doing it, it doesn't make it right. And if we look at Jesus' description of the day of judgment, where are most people headed?
Yeah.
Yeah. So our goal should not be to do what everybody else is doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, guys, we've come to past the end of the program. Any last thoughts and comments before we close out? I do want to thank the people that did send in some comments. Thank you very much for that. We also would want and invite all of you in the audience, whether you're listening live or at the recordings, send us in some questions and comments. Maybe there's other subjects that you want us to talk about and share from the biblical standpoint.
Mm-hmm. And maybe just a closing comment with that is just remind yourself of Ephesians chapter 4, what Paul says there. Regardless of what culture teaches, that's not the way that you learned Christ. The truth of Christ is you put off the old self, you put on the new self, and you're conformed to Jesus and not to your culture.
In fact, we should have had this verse somewhere in there that occurred to me just now. Romans 12, verse 2. Be not fashioned according to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.